Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Modern Japan History Association's New Books on Japan series. And today we are very excited to have with us two extremely distinguished presenter and commentator. So first of all, allow me to introduce Morgan Pitelka, who is our presenter today. And Professor Pitelka is the Bernard L. Herman Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he teaches broadly on ancient, medieval, and early modern Japan and the history of Japanese material culture. He is the author or editor of 8 books, so I probably don't have time to mention all of them, and I will just mention some of his more recent ones today. So in 2021, he published a co-edited beautiful volume of letters from various figures in the Sengoku and Edo eras of Japan. And in 2018, he also edited a massive 4-volume set of criticism and primary sources for understanding the history of Japanese art. And in 2016, he published one of my favorite books, a single-authored monograph called Spectacular Accumulation, Material Culture, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Samurai Sociability. This book is spectacular in many ways, not least of which is the full-color images, and I've used it very successfully in a number of my courses over the years. Today, Professor Pitelka will present on his newest book entitled Reading Medieval Ruins, Urban Life and Destruction in 16th-Century Japan, which came out from Cambridge University Press in 2022. And we're extremely thrilled and excited to announce that just earlier today, in fact, this book received honorable mention for the John Whitney Hall Prize, which is a prize that covers all of Japanese studies, all disciplines, all time periods. And then we are also extremely excited to have as our commentator today, Professor Ethan Segal, who's Associate Professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University, where he teaches very widely on Japanese history, economic history, the history of women and gender, history and film, and contemporary Japanese pop culture, among other topics. In addition to his first book entitled Coins, Trade, and the State, Economic Growth in Early Medieval Japan, which came out from the Harvard University Asia Center Press in 2011, he has also published numerous articles and book chapters on Japanese economic, monetary, and political history. And he is currently working on a book project on the history of medieval economic thought in Japan, as well as what he's calling side projects, but also sound extremely fascinating, on Hojo Masako and women in early warrior society, as well as depictions of medieval Japan on film. And so without further ado, I will let Morgan and Ethan take us away.
Ethan, do we want to start with you?
We can, sure. Well,
Thank awesome.
you. Yeah, thank you, Nick, for organizing this, and to both Nick and Morgan for inviting me to be a part of this session. Sure, I guess I could open with just a few brief thoughts. I want to leave most of the time for all the people who kindly came tonight to interact with Morgan rather than to listen to me blather on. But by way of kind of a brief introduction, I'm not sure how many people in the Zoom room have had a chance to read the book, which is a wonderful read, and I highly recommend for a number of reasons. For those who haven't had a chance yet to look at it, what is this book about? Well, I guess I'll suggest 3 things, although maybe many more. Of course, it's about a particular site, Ichijōdani, which is the background of Morgan's image you'll see right there, and the warrior clan that built it up, managed and ruled over the site, and Echizen province, which was the Asakura. It offers a new and interesting perspective on the struggles and fate of the Asakura, a regional daimyo family that lost out and was destroyed in the violence of the Sengoku period, as well as vivid descriptions of a powerful and successful provincial city of around a little over 10,000 people, I understand, at its peak. It's also a book about archaeology and the power of an archaeological site and the materials unearthed there to reveal important things about the past, including daily life, commerce and trade, religious practices, and more. And it's a challenge to the widely accepted narrative found not only in works written for general audiences, but in many scholarly works too, that the late 16th century process of unification initiated by Oda Nobunaga was necessary or even heroic. And some of the reasons I really like the book First of all, those of you who read it will know it's written in a tone and a style that I think non-specialists, including, I would suspect, undergraduates, can handle and understand. And this is clear even from the opening pages, which tell us or posit the story of a woman from a nearby village visiting a doctor in Ichijōdani, and includes descriptions of the doctor's office, the kinds of medicines, tools, and books he had available to him, and more. The encounter itself, as Morgan notes, is fictionalized, but it's plausible based on the materials actually excavated at the site. And it's a wonderful way to help illustrate how objects found at a site like this, which, as Morgan notes, can sometimes seem static or passive as artifacts, can in fact come alive and reveal important things about life at the time that they were made and used. It's also, at least for me, I found it really informative, revealing all kinds of new things. For example, about ceramics, which those of us who know Morgan's work will find not surprising, but including how and where they were made and the different styles and traditions that could be found even in the single province of Echizen. So, I mean, I will confess to having been guilty of having learned about the old 6 kilns geographic view that he critiques in the book, which I now know is inaccurate. For those curious to learn more, be sure to read the appropriate parts of chapter 2 in this book, which introduce the 3 great families of earthenware: the Haji type, pieces fired at higher temperatures in a reduction atmosphere, the Sue type, and pieces fired at an even higher temperature, I guess, with natural ash glaze, the Shiki type. And Morgan, feel free to correct me at some point if I'm misrepresenting any of that. But the key thing was that none of these were bound to specific geographic areas, which for me was maybe the more enlightening part. Or his discussion, the book's discussion of Nobunaga's destruction of Enryakuji, which I think is well known to many of us, but I had not realized prior to reading this book was so directly tied to Nobunaga's campaigns against the Asakura. A final notable thing that I think was great about this book was it leads us to challenge some of our received or preconceived ideas, such as the inevitability of Sengoku daimyo warfare culminating in the unified early modern state. It's a hard idea to rethink, since in the hands of some scholars, it seems like the political and military situation really from the Onin War of the late 1460s until the end of the 16th century was kind of stuck in some repeating loop. That ambitious daimyo set out to control Kyoto because they wanted the prestige that the shogun and the emperor could give them. But when they got enough, they controlled enough territory or resources to become contenders to actually do that, they would inevitably be overturned by their own ambitious lieutenants or lose out to neighboring rivals. And this story just seems to kind of repeat. And indeed, if you read some of the accounts of the Sengoku period written a few decades ago, perhaps now, they're in some sense almost unreadable because of the repetitive nature and the names that pop up repeatedly. And this, I think, helps us to rethink some of those older tropes. So that's kind of a very brief introduction to some of the things that I really liked about the book and maybe some of its arguments. Morgan, I had a few questions I'd love to toss out to you and let you run with as much or as little as you care to. And then, of course, please, those of you who are here in the room, feel free to contribute questions through the chat. We might not get to them until a little later in the evening, but don't lose your train of thought. If anything that we talk about sparks a question or comment, feel free to type it in there and we'll be sure to get to it before the evening comes to an end. I thought I'd begin, Morgan, if you don't mind, with an open invitation, I guess, for you to speak a little bit about how this book relates to the broader field, as well as how it sits in your own kind of academic or scholarly trajectory. We really don't have many books in English on medieval cities. 2 of the few that I can think of are Matt Stavros's book on Kyoto, which of course isn't just a medieval book. It kind of traces the history of that city over a much longer span. And then Bruce Patton's book on Hakata, which maybe is a little closer to yours in the sense that it wasn't the capital, right? But there are really very few such works, at least in English. And when it comes to archaeological studies of medieval cities, and admittedly, that's not my field, but the only thing I was able to find, I'm sure this work, right? The Archaeology of Medieval Towns, Case Studies from Japan and Europe, which does include a chapter by a Japanese scholar, Onuma Satoshi, on Ichijōdani. But that's really, I think, the only thing in English on the topic. So I wonder if you want to speak a little bit about how you see your book building on your own earlier scholarship and what its relationship might be to other publications in the field.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ethan, for the generous overview of some of the topics in the book. Thanks, Nick, for inviting me, and everyone for coming. You know, in some sense, the origins of this book are actually in people, as is so often the case with academic projects. And I'm so moved to see in the audience for this call some of the people who influenced me the most. I'll just call out by name Louise Court, who is, curator emerita of Asian ceramics at the National Museum of Asian Art at the Smithsonian, and who introduced me to Ichijōdani as an incredibly rich site for the study of ceramics and how they were used in people's lives. That's really my original interest in the study of Japanese history. But also Suzanne Gay, who taught me Japanese at Oberlin College, and of course is a distinguished historian of medieval Japan, and who, as I progressed through my academic career, I consulted with and turned to more and more often, and who is an urban historian and who introduced me to the works of Wakita Haruko and many other of the scholars in Japan who I ended up reading, to kind of fill out the secondary scholarship as the foundation of this project. Many others as well, more recent scholars like Michelle Damien, who organized an amazing panel, which was one of the first times that I was able to talk about my research on Ichijōdani, and to do so with another scholar of medieval Japan was really exciting. So these projects are always collective endeavors, community efforts in a sense, and I just wanted to offer my thanks to many folks in the Japanese studies community. I think also that helps me to articulate how this project came to be. And that is that I have a longstanding interest in ceramics. And so I'm always interested in the places, the sites, the museums in Japan that serve as these kind of repositories of ceramics as a form of historical evidence. And Ichijōdani is one of the best. I mean, even if the only thing you care about is ceramics in the 16th century, in some ways, there's almost no place better to look. You really can, as you suggested, Ethan, get a hold of the way in which Ichijōdani is special. So, for example, the province of Echizen is home to one of the most important medieval ceramic traditions, the Echizenware tradition, which is a kind of functional tradition that's most famous for big storage jars. I talk in the book about how lots of kitchen and dining implements, kind of tools of daily food prep, were also made in the Echizen kilns and then shipped into Ichijōdani, but also to lots of other locations all across Japan. So you have something local and special in the world of ceramics in Ichijōdani, but you also have these kind of ubiquitous objects that are found in many places, like kawarake, the low temperature earthenware ritual vessels that were, in the words of Louise Court, disposable but indispensable, these kind of one-use items. You have imported ceramics from China, high temperature glazed ceramics from the Seto and Mino kilns. So this wonderful mix of the local, the national and the regional, the kind of East Asian ceramics all coming into one site. So for me, this was an ideal location to do research because of my longstanding interest in ceramics. But I also have become invested over the years in the study of the history of the samurai and the history of warriors as patrons, the history of warriors as, key actors in pre-modern Japan who are more complex than their popular representation, as we were talking about before, Ethan, in television in Japan and the United States would lead us to believe. And one of the topics that I have found myself attracted to over the years is complicating the picture of warriors and focusing more on their cultural and social activities, their ritual practices, and a little less in some ways on their military and political accomplishments. And so this was a way to wrestle with some of those issues. And then lastly, you know, I was trained in the 1990s, and my memory of the state of the field in the 1990s is that social history and intellectual history were two of the most vibrant fields. And I didn't do either one of those things. I was one of the few people working on material culture. And I suppose I would have called myself at the time a cultural historian. And now we've had this material turn. People are much more interested in bodies, environments, and objects. And I found that in this project, I was able to finally do something like a social history, finally try to get at the experience of regular people in their daily lives in a way that in my first two research projects, I really just couldn't. I didn't have the materials, and it wasn't the main area of focus. So for me, all of those different elements came together to make this one of the most gratifying projects I've worked on. The one other thing that I'll mention, and I think there's a lot more to talk about here, is that the field of archaeology in Japan is just so incredibly rich. And we have professional archaeologists working in that field, of course, many amazing archaeologists who I've learned a lot from. Here on the call, Walter Edwards is here. You know, folks like Simon Kainer, many others who have taught me a lot and who write articles and books in English. The project that you mentioned, Ethan, one of the only other books available in English about medieval urban centers, is a project that Simon Kainer organized with Japanese colleagues. But there's so much more. I mean, all of this, including my book, is just skimming the surface of an absolutely overwhelmingly rich field that I hope more historians, but also scholars in other fields, will dig into, pun intended.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot we could talk about with that, including, I guess, building off of your comments, right? And some of the challenges of trying to do this project. I mean, on the one hand, I think you describe in the book how Ichijōdani was similar to some other medieval urban sites. That's actually crucial to the book's argument, because you're trying to articulate the importance of provincial cities to understanding life in late medieval Japan. But in some other ways, Ichijōdani is kind of unique, right? And one of the ways I think it's unique is that because of how it was so horribly destroyed in 1573 by the armies of Nobunaga, burning it all down, there are basically no written materials left at all. So you're really forced to completely work from archaeological materials. You know, and it places the very rich description, which is wonderful, you know, reminds me of the work I've read of some of our great art historian colleagues, for example. But I wonder if you wanted to say a few words about, you know, the challenges or the rewards of working, you know, trying to write a history, working almost exclusively from archaeological materials.
Yeah. Well, a theme in the study of Japanese history and culture broadly is, of course, this interplay between centers and peripheries, right? And so, of course, in the study of modern Japan, this gets teased out in terms of colonialism, imperialism, the Japanese Empire. But I think it also is an important part of the history of, for example, Japanese anthropology, and the push and pull between narratives of the nation, narratives of national identity, and strong regional, diverse identities that are also, to a certain degree, reclaimable in the modern era through good ethnographic work. And so that's a theme in Japanese studies that I think we're all aware of. In the Tokugawa period, actually, whether we choose to label that period the Edo period or the Tokugawa period, is already staking a kind of claim. And do we think that what matters is a family or is it a place? Studies that are looking at domains and the vibrancy and agency of the domain versus studies that are really centered on Edo or the Bakufu, the kind of top-down systems of the Tokugawa. All these themes, I think, are an important part of the terrain that we're all working and thinking in. And one of the aspects of this project that was really attractive was the chance to just be rooted in a place that is not Kyoto, which is my usual home in Japan. Very happily, I love Kyoto. And my next project, I hope, will be based in Kyoto again. But to try to think differently and think in a different place, using the unusually rich and abundant materials from the archaeological sites in Ichijōdani, was just a kind of an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. And I struggled with the question of the specificity of that site versus the how generalizable it is, and I tried to have my cake and eat it too by saying Ichijōdani is more than just a little Kyoto. It's more than just a kind of pale shadow of the capital. And the Asakura are doing something that is meaningful and significant beyond just reproducing the rituals of the Ashikaga in Kyoto. Although a lot of what they are doing is a smaller version of the things that the Ashikaga had done in the past. And I think that one of the ways that we can connect the dots and see the activities that unfold in a place like Ichijōdani as being special, as being unique, is through the interaction with the local environment. I have this picture of the valley behind me. It's a really special place. Today, of course, it's a fairly rural, pretty pastoral location. But even in the artists' reimaginings of what the city must have looked like in the 16th century, it's so hemmed in by the valley. It's such a distinctive urban location. And I wanted in the book to try to wrestle with how it was simultaneously entangled with other urban sites and the flows of people and things across the Japanese archipelago, but also special and different. And I try to make the pitch at the end of the book, and I'm straying into territory that I probably don't belong in, that there's almost an ethical imperative when we study the medieval world to move beyond the top-down narratives of the powerful, to move beyond the emperor and his court, to move beyond the shogunate, and to try to understand the lives of regular people, and those who are living far and wide across the archipelago of Japan. And so I hope that some of that is successful.
Absolutely. I definitely want to return to that ethical issue maybe in a few minutes, but just before we leave the physical site itself,
Yeah.
There were a couple of things I wanted to ask about for my own edification, and maybe others would find these interesting too. So you noted, for example, I'm going to quote a couple of things at you if you'll let me, in chapter 4, which is material foundations of faith. So a lot about religious sites. The unusually thorough excavation allows us to avoid the problematic distinction often made between elite and commoner religious traditions. And I wonder if you might want to explain a little bit more about that. And related, I guess, elsewhere in the book, you talk about the idea that objects can have agency. And I'm really keen to hear about that. It's something I've read works, for example, in environmental history by colleagues and good friends who make similar kinds of arguments, I think. And they're arguments that I confess, maybe I'm too old-fashioned, but I sometimes struggle with non-human, non-animal agency and what exactly that means. But you wrote very eloquently in the introduction that objects can affect society because of the values, properties, and forces attributed to them. Or you talked also about the tree. I don't know if the tree's in the background there, outside the remains of the Asakura residence that you always stop by and visit. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of those topics, if you would.
So the agency of objects is a topic that has, is a theme throughout my work. I should just say up front, objects do not make decisions. So agency is almost a metaphor, it's almost a way of trying to decenter the primacy of the individual human subject, right? And to try to understand a web of influences that, plays a role in history. I'm very interested in the role of chance, the role of contingency in the past. But I certainly don't think T-Bulls decided who won a battle. But I do think that, as you said, and as I tried to explain in the introduction, because of how a human society treats and understands the meaning of an object, that object can have a kind of influence on people's decisions and people's actions. So that's my understanding of agency. There are, of course, anthropologists who've done very sophisticated work on the role of things in different social contexts and have made stronger arguments than I can make for the idea that things have agency. But in a religious context, obviously, there is the belief that icons can look back at worshipers and practitioners. And there's the way that a community can pour material resources, but also spiritual beliefs into something like a sekibutsu or a sekito, these wonderful stone Buddhas and stone stupas that I talk about in the chapter you mentioned, Ethan. And I want to mention another influence here, who's the wonderful historian of pre-modern Japan, Janet Goodwin, who has worked on these topics and who I want to acknowledge as someone I learned a lot from. But trying to understand how the plethora of stone, of gravestones, basically, that still survive in Ichijōdani came to be. Some of them are marked and some of them have inscriptions that we can read. But a lot of them are found in what we think are the original locations around the outskirts of the valley, where they were placed after funeral ceremonies, different kinds of funerary practices, was one of the pleasures of this project. It really connected me to the, again, to the kind of daily concerns and engagement with a Buddhist worldview that I think the residents of Ichijōdani had for over a century. The brilliant archaeologists in Ichijōdani have mapped and entered all the details of these stone markers into databases, and a lot of that material is available through their website. Sekibutsu and sekito are also found in every town and city practically in Japan, and I think it is not one but many dissertations waiting to happen. It's such a cool topic and something I hope more scholars of pre-modern Japan will pay attention to. I did want to mention also that there was recently a review of the book that came out in Japanese, thanks to a wonderful historian of medieval Japan, Xiaolong Huang. And she is a specialist in medieval religion, and she called out very rightly that I pay much more attention to the objects left over in Ichijōdani related to religion than I do the sites. And that is because I'm a material culture guy. So the sekito and sekibutsu were vibrant and interesting to me in ways that trying to reconstruct what the different temples and shrines in the valley might have been just was not. And so I chose to put my energy elsewhere. But I like the idea that that when the elaborately decorated temples and shrines that are often the work of the ruling class, right? The kind of deposits in the Buddhist bank accounts of the rich and powerful, when those are burned away by Nobunaga's armies, that what's left are these earthenware ritual vessels and these stone monuments. That was meaningful to me, and the idea that the most plebeian forms of worship were the ones that, in a sense, endured.
Thank you. Maybe we should turn then to the Asakura and their struggles with Oda Nobunaga a little bit. You know, I really love the image you give us in this book of Asakura Yoshikage, the final lord of the Asakura domain, as someone kind of fighting for a different vision of Japan, one in which regional cities and territories could maintain their independence. And, you know, you do this by highlighting the ways that Ichijōdani was a major commercial and cultural hub that engaged in trade with other parts of Japan and even other parts of East Asia, and sponsored and hosted visits by important poets, artists, scholars, and the like. And as you already alluded to, I think in your earlier comments, you're critical of earlier scholarship that has dismissed provincial cities as merely trying to mimic the design and cultural forms of the capital, the so-called little Kyotos. So I wonder if you want to just say a little more about some of the ways that Ichijōdani and the Asakura innovated, like what were some of the ways specifically maybe that they took existing traditions, be it in architecture or the arts, and took those in new directions? It seems like that would, really bolster that kind of view.
Yeah, this is a tricky part of the book for me because I didn't want to romanticize the Asakura in any way. I don't want to imply that they had an ethical vision of their rule or of their role in the Japanese polity during the Sengoku period in a way that Nobunaga did not, or that Fabienne, who's on the call, has pushed me sometimes in ways I really appreciate about the kind of counterfactual that's almost embedded in this book, the kind of idea that things didn't have to turn out the way they did, that Japan didn't have to be reunified by these three heroic but also very violent warlords. And I agree with those critiques. Instead, I wanted to try to imagine what the range of choices might have been for Asakura Yoshikage, what the worldview and the spectrum of possibilities were for a provincial ruler before Nobunaga did what we all know Nobunaga did, right? And to take seriously the idea that there were imagined futures that didn't involve unification under the Oda, the Toyotomi, the Tokugawa names, right? And that's not to say that those futures, that we should explore what a world dominated by the Asakura would have looked like. I don't know, and I don't care, frankly. But rather that's how they lived, right? Was imagining those futures. And that to take seriously, I mean, I'm not a historian I'm not an intellectual historian, so I don't really do epistemology, but it seems to me that to take seriously the uniqueness of the place, we have to imagine that the worldview was one that was not constrained by the teleology of unification, since that had not yet taken place. I suppose it's obvious in a sense, but I wanted to really try to put myself in the shoes, or the wooden clogs, as the case may be, of the residents of this valley, who wouldn't have imagined that it would be burned to the ground so quickly. I also
think that, go ahead.
Go, please.
I was just saying, I think that does come through, particularly in chapter 6, where even with a few months before it's destroyed, I think you make it pretty clear that it would not have seemed such to the people at the time.
Yeah, and I guess there's been so much good work by our colleagues on the idea of losers in Japanese history, whether it's the Taira, or the losers of the Meiji Restoration, or whoever. There's obviously a certain romance in Japanese culture. I don't want to be anachronistic, but it does come up a number of times at different historical moments. And I don't see a lot of that romance adhering to the people who were absolutely stomped by Nobunaga. And I think it's because the lessons culturally that have been drawn out of that moment are something different. And so I don't want to romanticize the Asakura or the residents of Ichijōdani as losers, but it's curious to me why this part of Japanese, the story of Japan's history is so easily forgotten, or at least memorialized for other reasons and in different ways.
Well, it's a great transition, because that's the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is what you've written in this book, and your call for us to kind of rethink the ways we remember late 16th century Japan and the process of unification, right? You note that modern people, including us as scholars even, tend to see the actions of the so-called unifiers, including the horrific violence that they perpetrated, in which you describe in pages that are difficult to read at times in the book, right, as necessary and inevitable, in part because, and now I'm quoting from the book, we tacitly accept the teleological periodization of the modern nation state, right? Which kind of, I think, answers the question you were just posing. And in the epilogue, you note the tension or the gap maybe between the serious archaeological research going on at the site, and here again is a quote from you, the tourist-focused pageantry of what's promoted as a kind of medieval theme park. That's definitely something I can resonate with some of the sites that I've looked at. And that this theme park, promotes things like the chance to see objects from daily life or to walk in the valley and be one with nature, and that leaves out all of the violence that you wrote about in the book. And you're critical even of museum displays that do similar things, right? That promote the chance to touch objects, even if they're replicas that were used in daily life, but leave out the violent destruction that brought the city to its end. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this. What would be a better way for the people who manage these sites? And, we all know the practical reality of a museum like Rekihaku, which struggles to pull in visitors, right?
Yeah.
Or I imagine the Ichijōdani site, though I've never been there myself, but based on how remote it seems to be, based on the descriptions I've read in your book, again, probably needs to attract visitors in part to justify this continued funding. So how do we balance this ethical obligation to morally depict these people who were so brutally stomped upon, as you said, and yet also, attract visitors and attract dollars and attract government resources and things like this?
Yeah. Well, I very much feel like an outsider when I offer these critiques of museums or of archaeological displays. I'm a historian. I work in America. I write for an English, readership, and I don't have to face the political and funding struggles that my colleagues and people who I've learned so much and admire so much in Japanese museums and archaeological research centers are facing. So I owe them. I'm so thankful to them for the work they've done that allowed me to try to think about these topics. But it is so striking, for a decade probably, when you went to Rekihaku, the room that talked about daily life in medieval Japan, two of the main examples were Kusado Sengen, this merchant community from, not that far from Hiroshima now, that is not documented. We don't have, archival records from, but that we have great archaeological materials from. And then Ichijōdani were both front and center as, examples of how we can learn about our Japanese brethren from the medieval period. But the destruction of these two sites was just not part of the didactics at all. And Kusado Sengen, it seems to have been environmental. That seems to me very relevant today. That should be highlighted. And obviously, in the case of Ichijōdani, it's, as I sometimes have called it, it's Japanese on Japanese war, right? It is killing within the what is now considered a kind of ethno-national community. And that's a part of history that Japanese, popular culture and scholarship is happy to talk about in certain instances and happy to overlook in others. So I've long struggled with the role of the samurai in Japanese history and the best way in museological terms to illustrate that history. I think swords are romanticized and aestheticized. They're kind of sanitized in ways that are problematic. One of the main functions of swords is to cut off the head of a defeated opponent so that head can be cleaned and shown for a reward. And I think that should be part of the story. I think the brutality of war has to be at least one of the ingredients in our educational activities. Of course, it can be toned down depending on what is considered to be age appropriate. But people love the battle scenes in the taiga dramas. People love the images of warfare in movies and anime and manga. Maybe there's some way to acknowledge the violence and just let a little bit of the romanticism in to make it palatable to the general public. But to try to tell the story of Ichijōdani without really acknowledging that Oda Nobunaga's armies burnt it to the ground, to me is just doing a kind of, it's doing another violence to this community. And yeah, I suspect that it will change. I mean, the museum at Ichijōdani is evolving. There's a brand new structure. There's all these new displays. I think things will evolve. But I hope we never go back to just pretending, kind of putting our fingers in our ears and pretending like nothing bad ever happened there.